Today I'm going to start replacing the paper capacitors in this receiver, this model receiver. And the paper capacitors, what I mean are the capacitors like this one. Notice that there's an outside foil. It is a 0.1 mic. You may not be able to read that too easily, but it's a 0.1 microfarad, 400 volt capacitor. So that one I'm going to replace with this capacitor, which is a 630 volt capacitor. Let me see if I can get that to focus a little better. And notice that it says 104K. And what that means is it's 10 and then 4 more zeros is what the 4 means. And then K refers to 10,000 picofarads or 0.1 microfarads. If you're not familiar with this, you might want to look at the coding for capacitors like this, but it's not hard once you figure out the basically you put 4 zeros after the 10, and then you move the decimal place 6 places to the left. So the 4 places plus the 0 plus the 1, the decimal place goes right in front of the 1. So it's a 0.1 microfarad, 630 volt capacitor. And the last thing that I'll say about it is you notice it's a lot smaller than the one that's in there, and that gives you generally a lot more room in these chassis. Before I start doing that, you may notice that I have laid out a number of tools on the workbench, including over on the left there a few soldering guns. There are some techniques that I think it's useful to talk about, and as I do, please understand that technique is, my wife is an artist, and everything is technique to her. And the reason is it's all individual. You can learn some things from people that have done this before, but in the final analysis, you have to find the technique that works for you. Back in the day, it was common to do soldering with soldering irons or soldering guns instead of soldering irons. And I have 3 of them here. Now this one is actually the soldering iron that I used in 1958. Bought it in 1958. This is a fairly new and much higher wattage iron. It's also by Weller. And then finally over on the side is a smaller Weller iron that I bought about 10 or 15 years ago. What I'm going to be doing is showing you a little bit about the technique of removing the old capacitors and replacing them with the new. But one of the things that I'm going to do first is replace the tip in this soldering gun. This is my vintage Weller 8200 soldering gun. And so let me show you that. But before I do, I would like to show you just one quick picture out of Radio Receiver Servicing by John Fry. So here is the picture, and I'll show you in a second what the cover of the book looks like, and you can find the book on AmericanRadioHistory.com, the website that I've talked about a number of times in this series. You notice in the upper left-hand corner is a Weller soldering gun. Also a 1/4-inch electric drill, some open-end wrenches, a set of nut drivers, that's things like this, which are also useful, various tools like needle nose pliers, diagonal cutters, sometimes called dikes, and wire strippers, In a minute, I'm going to show you one of these tools that's shown down here. It's a little hard to see in this picture. And then a hacksaw, some files, and other things. Obviously, you don't want to have to be cutting a lot of metal. But back in the day, it wasn't uncommon for modifications to radios to require that you cut the chassis with a hacksaw and so on. The reason that I show you this set of hand tools is you may notice that nowhere in this picture is a modern soldering iron. Most of those irons, although they existed back in the day, and there were some very nice ones, some huge American Beauty and other soldering irons back in the day, most service people used soldering guns in the 50s and 60s. They have some advantages. They heat up quickly, and then when you turn them off, they really turn off. They stop heating, so you can lay it back down on your bench, and in a minute or two, it's cool, and you don't you're not in danger of setting something on fire. Most of the modern soldering irons came in with printed circuit boards. And when service people began having to work on printed circuit boards in the late 60s and early 70s is when most of the modern low wattage irons came in. Before that, soldering guns were sort of the tool of choice, implement of destruction, some people might say. So let me show you how I changed the tip on that, but before I do, let me show you the book that this picture came out of. Here is the book, Radio Receiver Servicing by John Fry. I recommend that you download and at least look through this book before you start trying to repair or work on radios. This is a revised edition that I think was published in '59 of an original book that was written in '54 or '55. It's a pretty good book. There's another one that I'll point to called Elements of Radio Servicing by Marcus and Levy that I've talked about in a previous episode. I suggest you also download that book. It can be found on the internet, though I don't think it's on the American Radio History site. But it is, if you put in Elements of Radio Servicing, you'll find it in a PDF form. Okay, now let's talk about changing the tip in that soldering iron, or soldering gun. So here is the gun, and the tip that we're going to change is here. There are two nuts that hold the tip in right here. We'll be loosening those. And then we'll be removing this tip, which, by the way, the reason I'm removing it is it's maybe hard to see, but it's badly pitted right here, and it's going to break through very quickly. And so I thought it might be a good time to change it. These tips you can buy online. I bought these from Radio Shack, but I recently bought some through Amazon. The tips are kind of expensive because they're made of copper, solid copper, and they'll run you about $5 a tip. So in other words, a pack like this will run you $8 to $10, a pack of two. Okay, so let's get on with it. The first thing we want to do is loosen these screws. Well, I'm having a little trouble. Let me get a different pair of pliers. Okay, I'm back with a heavier set of pliers, and then we're going to loosen this tip, this nut. Once you've loosened them just a little bit, then they come out quite easily. And you'll notice that the tips are bent to go into those little holes. So the first thing we have to do is get these nuts off of this tip and onto the other tip, and then bend the ends so that they can replace it. Okay, now I have straightened out the ends so that I can pull these nuts off the end of the old tip. And they're having a little bit of trouble there. Well, let me see if I need to, yeah, I think I need to work on the end of this just a little bit. Okay, now I've gotten them straight. They have to be pretty much straightened out, and then these slide off. And now we'll get out the new tip and put the nuts on it. Okay, here's the new tip, and we'll put the nuts on here. By the way, this is the sort of thing, one reason I'm showing this is it's unlikely that you'll see this very many other places. But this is one of those things that, frankly, if you were working in a radio shop, you should already know how to do this in the 50s. But if you didn't, it'd be one of the first things they'd show you is how to replace your soldering gun tip. Because back in the day, you'd go through about a tip a month in just repairing stuff a few hours a day. So you had to really know how to replace these. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to bend the end, and we're going to use about this much, and then just bend it over. And then we're going to do the same thing with this one. And now we can insert those into the gun like this and then tighten the nuts back up. So I won't show you that. It's that's just a simple mechanical skill. Okay, now we've got them there. We're going to give them just a little bit of a tightening here, just to make them snug. You don't want to over-tighten them. You can easily strip the threads, though generally the equipment made back in the 50s was still being built largely to military standards, and so it tended to be a whole lot better than the back in the day or in the present day where everything is built to a price. So there's the tip replaced. Now the next thing we have to do is tin it. To tin the tip, we press the trigger on the gun, and a light comes on right there, and the tip starts to get hot, and in a very short period of time it will get hot enough to melt solder. And we want to coat the whole tip with rosin core solder. Now that's important that you didn't miss what I said about rosin core. You want to get the entire tip coated with solder, and the solder has to be a non-acid solder. Here is the solder that I am using. Now I will warn you that this is a tin lead. The label is torn off here a little bit, but it is a 60-40. In other words, the ratio of tin to lead is 60% tin, 40% lead. And the core, that is the center of the, this is actually hollow, and in the center of the solder is a rosin. It's a flux. There also are fluxes that use acid that are used in plumbing work. Make sure you don't buy acid solder. Only use rosin core solder. If it doesn't say rosin core solder on it, just don't use it. Okay, now we have replaced the tip in this gun. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about removing the old capacitors. And for that, I have a little demonstration here. This is an old tube socket chucked up in a vise here. the purpose of which is to show you the typical way that radios were produced in the day. There would be a lead. Hope I can get down close enough that you can see this without it going out of focus. I think that's about as close as I'm going to get. The lead goes down, goes through the hole in the tube socket, and then is bent back over and crimped. And then this would be soldered. Now, the reason I'm not showing you this in the radio is it's almost impossible to see this inside the radio, especially if you have the camera in the way. In other words, I can either show you what's going on or I can get to it, but I can't do both with the camera. So the question is, how do you remove this? Well, back in the day, there was a tool, and let me show you that. So here is a tool that usually came with most soldering guns, the Weller soldering guns of the day. Notice that there is a tip with a slot cut in it, and the idea is that you get that slot around that lead and then twist it to pull it loose. On the other end was a pointed tip, and both of these, this entire thing except for the plastic handle, is a metal that solder does not stick to. So the basic idea is you would use your soldering gun to melt the solder. You would use the fine tip to get a little bit of space under the lead, like that, and then you would put the slot under there and pry it up this way, and then you can pull it out like this. Notice that the end is now at an angle, at about a 90-degree angle. I don't recommend that you use that procedure. The reason is, over the years, these pins on these tube sockets have gotten old. And like all of us that have gotten old, they've gotten brittle. They will break. And if you break one, you have to generally you have to replace the entire socket. So what I recommend you do is don't try to unsolder the pin. Instead, and I'm going to insert this back in there for just a second to show you the technique. What I suggest you do is take a pair of diagonal cutters, get as close up here as possible, and clip it. Then all you have to do is get a hold of this little piece here when you have the soldering iron and the solder melted. Now remember, when you're doing this, there's solder on here. So you not only, this is soldered into this pin. And then get a hold of this now, because you no longer have this crimped over part. Instead, what you have is this. And now, if you get a hold of this part with your needle nose pliers after you melt the solder and then just pull it out, you'll find that it comes out very easily. Then you can remove the solder using some solder wick. I'll show you how to do that in just a second. And now you have a place to insert the new component. A handy way to remove solder from things like this. Now they make little, the trade name is a solder pult, but some people call them solder suckers or solder removers that use vacuum. But one of the easy ways to remove the solder from a pin like this is to use this solder wick. Here is what it looks like. Once again, this came from Radio Shack, and they call it desoldering braid. I think solder wick may be a trade name. At any rate, what this is a braid that is also impregnated with some flux. So when you put the soldering iron on, you lay this on top of the lead, and then you put the soldering gun or the soldering iron on here. You heat the pin through the braid. The solder will wick up into the braid, and then when you pull it away, as you see here, the solder will come away. You see this has been used a few times there on the end. Now, of course, as you use it up, you cut it off with your diagonal cutters. Okay, so that's the technique that I'm going to be using to remove and replace the paper capacitors in this radio. I think at this point I'm going to pause. I don't know whether I'm going to add a second section to this video or do it in a separate video after I have replaced all the paper capacitors in the radio. But in case it's in the next video, let me close out by saying, hope you learned something here. And there certainly will be more. We're going to try to get this old radio back playing again. But in the meantime, have a nice day.